Well, good morning, and I am triply excited. Billy Malasso, who is the executive director of Reading Recovery, is here to talk with me. I totally appreciate his being able to do that. Uh, and he is just an amazing person and has said some amazing things, and we'll get into that in a moment. But let's start, first of all, Billy, tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure, I'll tell you, and I'm a longtime listener and reader, but a first-time contributor. So I'm excited to be here with you this morning. Love your work and love what you've been doing for the conversation in the larger literacy movement. So I
Well,
appreciate
thank you
that.
for that. Thank you.
Yeah. I joined the Reading Recovery community about 3 years ago as the executive director for Reading Recovery Council of North America. And my role within the community is really to help the trainers, the teacher leaders, and the teachers do their work better. My background is actually in adult learning. It's not an early literacy education. So I have a doctoral degree from Michigan State in adult and higher education. And my background is around adult learning and college students and working with training and professional development programs. I'm excited to be here. I, I said that I had joined the Reading Recovery community 3.5 years ago. That was actually not my first introduction to Reading Recovery. Both of my boys, they're 14-year-old twins, are Reading Recovery students. So in first grade, they continue to struggle in first grade with reading. So they went through the intervention at their local school. And I learned about Reading Recovery at that point. And when I saw this job available, I'm like, wait a minute, I know what this thing is. I believe in it. I know how to help my kids. So I applied for it. And I'm very thankful that the community selected me for executive director. So I have two perspectives, one as executive director, but what is probably more important is one as a parent.
That is just, I didn't know that until just now, and that is outstanding. So some of this is from a parent's perspective,
Mhm.
and the fact that you had that, I totally understand there are some people for whom it didn't work for their child. And, I can't think of any intervention where that can't be said.
Right.
But on the other hand, there are thousands and thousands and maybe tens of thousands of children for whom it has worked. And that fact seems to be getting overlooked. Now,
Well, and Sam, what's interesting about what you just said is it happens that both of my boys needed additional work after Reading Recovery, but the things that I observed in Reading Recovery were significant. So my youngest, by 4 whole minutes, he went into first grade thinking he was the stink, he was the big man on campus, realized that he was not reading like everybody else, and started to get that I'm dumb feeling, and started articulating the sense that I'm dumber than everybody else. But because of his work with his Reading Recovery teacher and going through that 20 weeks of intervention, he came out of that saying, no, I can learn to read it. I just have some challenges that I have to overcome. And by second grade and third grade, he was sitting at the bus stop reading a book, even though he needed additional help. So that's significant. And it's one of the reasons that I believe in Reading Recovery. While we can't necessarily bring every student up to grade level, we still have a positive impact on all students that come with us.
so true. And the point that what happens afterwards matters a lot is something that I'm sure you're going to get into in the next set of questions. All right. Uh, we've seen a lot of advocacy messages coming out of Reading Recovery National. And first of all, is there really research that shows Reading Recovery works? What are the flaws in the claim that it doesn't work in subsequent years after intervention? And you wrote a very wonderful piece on that. So I'll just be quiet and let you handle that question.
Sure, and remind me if I miss a part of that question. As Reading Recovery community, kind of as that national voice for Reading Recovery, one of our roles is to really put out positive messages about the work that we do. One of the things that is incredibly frustrating right now is the amount of bullying that goes on around anybody who talks about literacy. If you're not 100% in lockstep with what I believe, I'm going to bully you until you stop talking. What's interesting is the caricature that the science of reading side of the debate has made about Reading Recovery is wholly inaccurate. We are one of the best intervention programs out there. We are one of the most researched intervention programs in early literacy. And I would argue that we're probably one of the most researched educational programs across all all content areas at the elementary level. That research is there, and it's strong, and it's consistent. I'll go back to, and probably the thing that we hang our hat on the most around the impact of reading recovery is the I3 grant from the early aughts. When we went through a national federal grant program with an external evaluator, we had random control trial. It was the gold standard of research in education. It was proven that reading recovery has a significant impact on students who go through the program and go through the intervention. It's interesting that people talk about reading recovery as if there's no evidence there, as if there's no research there, because it's all over the place. They're just not reading it because it's not consistent with their worldview, or they read it and they discount it because, again, it's not consistent with their worldview. I think the other part of your question was really around the sustained growth question. And one of the things that is a deficiency across educational research right now, particularly at the early levels of education, is a lack of research in educational interventions and what happens to those students 4 or 5 years down the road. And that's significant, because if we're doing positive work with our students now, but we're not sustaining that growth, we need to figure out what to do better, what to do differently, and make that happen for our students, for the intervention, and for our school communities. There was a research article that was published recently, which has gotten a lot of play in the social media ecosystem, that talked about sustained growth with reading recovery. And I was disappointed in that research study because there were some big challenges with it. Only 25% of the students who were actually in the intervention of the program in first grade made it to the third year study. So they had a 76% attrition rate. What happened to those 76% of the students? We don't know. That's a significant enough attrition rate of non-participants in the later study to raise questions about what the findings are really accurate, how accurate those findings really are. I think the other challenge with that particular research study that I was disappointed in is it considered a student who had 1 week of reading recovery equivalent to a student who had 20 weeks of reading recovery. That's a very, if you think about that from a medical model, which I hate doing, but it's a really good example, or a really good way to get your arms around the topic. If you think about it from a medical model, if I take 1 week of antibiotics versus the full course of antibiotics, that's a very different kind of outcome. So this particular study lumped in 1 week, 2 week, 3 weeks with 17, 18, 19, and 21 weeks. Those are very different kinds of students with very different outcomes. I will say, one of the things that I struggle with within the social media sphere, and there are times when I disengage for a week or two because I just can't take the BS that's kind of going on. One of the things that I struggle with a lot is thinking about reading recovery as a classroom program. We are not a classroom tier 1 program. We are a tier 3 intervention. We're a pull-out program that's designed for students to come out of the classroom. We individually tailor the instruction to the needs of that particular student, and then we return them back to the classroom when they've achieved some growth and achieved their grade level proficiency. A lot of the conversation that's out there talks about how we're classroom programs. And I'm like, wait a minute, you really don't know what you're talking about if you try to equate us with a classroom program. That's just not who we are. It's not what we do. We do believe that we have to have strong classroom programs. So we can intervene all we absolutely want to. But if they're going to return to a classroom that doesn't have strength, that's not a strong curriculum, that's not a strong set of teaching practices, those students aren't going to continue to make gains, and they're going to falter. So it's critical that those classroom programs are, and I went in several different directions there, but it's critical that those classroom programs, classroom instruction is as strong as it possibly can be.
Okay, and I'll just use a specific example I'm well aware of, and that's Susan Vincent and her district. Her district showed those long-term gains over 5 years, and she has all the data on that. But her district has that really strong tier 1 intervention.
Absolutely.
So, and I think Susan makes the point. You can't expect a 20-week intervention to have effects that go on for years and years and years. What you can expect of that 20-week intervention is to get them up to where the rest of the folks are. And then if there's a good tier 1 program, they're going to continue to progress. And that's exactly what happened in her district. So,
yeah, and in a number, and in many districts across the country. And, I think it's interesting. One of the great things about reading recovery is every student who goes through our program, whether it's the English language version, the French language version, the Spanish language version, or the model of our program for special ed students or multi-language learners who are in kind of 2nd through 5th grade, every single student who goes through our program, the teacher must submit pre and post test data. So we start out with pre-test to identify and diagnose what the students need. We conduct our intervention to bring the student to grade level, and then we post-test to see what that growth actually was. We've got decades of research that shows the impact of those students. And what's been frustrating is the number of schools who have lumped or bought into this rhetoric, the story that's been sold around science of reading, around phonics only, phonics first, and they've ignored the data. I think the other thing that I've struggled with a lot, and Sam, I'll be curious to see what you think about this, is this notion of what's the difference between a research-based program and an evidence-based program? Because people seem to use those words synonymously, and I'm not sure that they're synonymous. What do you think about that? Do you have an opinion?
I do, and now you're getting into my stats course.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, research-based, my take is that you actually do a study, blasey, blasey, blasey. Evidence-based is a little looser in my interpretation, and I'll stand corrected if I'm wrong. But evidence-based means that there's evidence out there. You're doing your interventions are all the rest based on a wide range of varying evidence out there. Am I close?
I put you on the spot there. I didn't tell you I was going to ask you that question. I think that everybody is right and everybody is wrong around these terms because there is no common definition of what research-based means and what evidence-based means. For me, and this is my own take, so if I'm wrong, you're welcome to correct me, and I'm sure there will be people who will be tweeting out about anything that I say today.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And that's an okay thing if it generates conversation. I see research-based as here are instructional practices that have been shown in research studies to be effective. So we're based on research that shows these things work. Evidence-based for me is how we put those things together in an intervention or a program or in a sequence of instructional practices have been tested, particularly with the random controlled trial, and have been shown that the way we've put them together actually has a positive impact. So for me, evidence-based is really about the specific intervention and the data that demonstrates that it's effective. Research-based is about these practices have been shown in research. What's interesting about reading recovery is we are both research-based and evidence-based. And most programs that are getting a lot of conversations out there, they can claim the research-based, and because they are pulling that strategy from research, but they can't demonstrate evidence because there's been no research on the particular sequence of experiences that program kind of articulates. And again, we're talking classroom instruction as well. The evidence just isn't there yet. Could it be? Sure, if they actually take the time to do the studies. One of the questions I often ask is, why are they not doing this? We've been in this movement of science of reading. So there are lots of words I could use to define it, but we'll call it a movement to be polite and civil. We've been in this movement for 5 or 6 years. Some of these programs had been around. One of the most popular programs was around in the Reading First generation when George Bush was president. Yet there continues to not be data and evidence that proves its effectiveness. Where is that data? Are they scared to actually collect that data because they're going to realize that their programs don't work? When they talk about sustained growth, they don't even have data about end of program, end of year data, let alone 3 years later. How can they argue anything around their programs when they don't have that evidence to prove that they're effective?
Well, I'm going to invite listeners to especially visit Paul Thomas,
Mm-hmm.
and the things he's done. He just yesterday posted something that showed that in the current wave of uh, science of reading legislation, that as a matter of fact, the scores have gone down, not up.
Right.
I just posted that on Twitter just before I came on with you. I'm sure that I get some feedback. Basically, uh, on the one hand, I view the sciences of reading, and I think
Mm-hmm.
Rachel Gabriel is a proponent of that point of view, that there are the sciences of reading. There's no and good old uh, there is no one. There are different sciences of reading, and you have to consider all the research, and that's been one of my calls all along. Consider all the research, not just the research that proves you. I'm afraid that very often what I call the social media version of this science of reading movement is all about, we've got this program, we're going to prove it works, and we're going to come in and look at evidence, and if we have evidence that doesn't support it, we just ignore it or try to make light of it or discount it or
Yep.
discredit it. I think that's exactly what's happened to some of the research around reading recovery, attempts to discredit. So, but boy, thank you for letting me rant there for a
Yeah,
moment.
no, it's okay. And Dr. Gabriel, Rachel, and Dr. Thomas as well. They neither of them are reading recovery trained. Neither of them necessarily have a particular positionality on the continuum of reading recovery versus everything else, or on one side of the continuum versus the other continuum. But they've been very powerful voices to say, wait a minute, all of this rhetoric that's out there is really not accurate. It's caricatures of all sides of this debate, and nobody's really talking about what's going on in the actual classroom. And that's the thing that we really need to figure out. What's actually happening in our classrooms? What's the impact of these state policies that are saying, do this and you can't do that? What impact is that going to have when we take tools out of the toolbox of teachers that they can't help an individual student who isn't functioning well under the current tier 1 system if they can't use other strategies, other tactics, other instructional practices to really help that student learn how to read and write?
So well put. Okay. Let's move on to the next question,
Mm-hmm.
and you may have partly answered it already. Uh, uh, we Does reading recovery teach phonics? And if so, how much and what kinds? And I want to especially hit that point of what kinds, because some of our friends seem to think that the only form of phonics is synthetic phonics. And
Mm-hmm.
yet P. David Pearson and others have listed out a whole host of different things. And my mantra has been for the longest time, what works with one kid doesn't always work with another.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, there are children out there, lots of them, that
Mm-hmm.
need synthetic phonics first. There's no question about that. But on the other hand, there are children that don't thrive with that and who need other approaches. And then I'm also looking at the research that Reading Research Quarterly just talked about lately, where they said, if you do phonics and you do things like Scanlon's approach, which involves problem solving and using context, if you use those together, that gets better results than if you just use phonics alone. So on this, so that's a little nuance to that. But I'll let you take over on, because I know the answer. Because
Right.
my gosh, my golly, I did teach recovery, and I'm quite aware that we do teach phonics, but not just synthetic phonics.
Right.
I hope I didn't steal any of your
No,
thunder
no,
and
you
take
didn't.
off.
And
Is there phonics in reading recovery or not?
The easiest question, or the easiest way to answer that question, is very direct. Of course, we teach phonics when the student needs phonetic assistance. I think it's really interesting. What I think confuses some folks who really don't understand the literature, really don't understand language around the use of synthetic phonics or analytic or whatever kind of phonics work that they do. We call it something different. We call it hearing, recording sounds and words, HRSIW. We pre-test on it, we instruct on it if that individual student needs it, and we post-test on it. So for 35 years, we've been testing, pre and post-testing on phonics. We just call it hearing, recording sounds and words. I think the thing that I've struggled with around synthetic phonics is, and I'll tell you my caricature of it, and I know that this is a caricature, but I'll tell you the way I've used synthetic phonics. Here's the list of all the phonics rules. We're going to start at number 1, and we're going to work down the list to number however many there are in that particular setting. And every student is going to go through number 1 through number 150, whatever it's going to be, in this exact sequence with this exact set of time, 1 week for this one, 1 week for that one, 1 week for that one. It does not acknowledge or look at students who already know 1 through 20 or maybe 20 through 30. It doesn't acknowledge that a student may be able to pick up number 4 in 2 days, but they need 2 weeks to figure out number 67. It is a one-size-fits-all program. And what's unfortunate in our educational system in the United States is we know one size does not fit all. And we need to have that option and those variations to meet the student where the student is and bring them to where they need to be. That's really what reading recovery does. We assess at the beginning. If they need strong phonics support, that's where we're going to spend a disproportionate amount of our time. If they don't need it, we're not going to cover material that they already have. How can you accelerate a student to move more quickly than their peers if you're going through the same instructional practices with every single student in the exact same amount of time? Some of the ways that we do that word work is really using Elkonin boxes. It's using magnetic letters. That also gets us kind of the manual dexterity around letters. We use a variety of practices that really connect with the student. If the student doesn't like Elkonin boxes, they struggle with it, that may not be a strategy that makes sense for them. And some students kind of struggle with that notion, or even with magnetic letters. The benefit of the reading recovery intervention is that teachers can look at the student and say, this is what this student needs. This is what they're connecting with. So this is the way we're going to instruct them and guide them through this process to learn to read and write.
Yeah, and I'll as someone who has done the practice, I'll just add the business of sentence production, word production, sentence production, and a ton of valuable information gets done. So we give the kids what they need, and they're definitely going to come away with Phonics Plus. Okay. So let's get on to the issue of comprehension then. What reading recovery, to my knowledge, in that What Works Clearinghouse and other places, is the only intervention of its kind that has shown gains in both decoding and comprehension. Some of the others have shown gains in decoding. So yeah, we teach them how to decode words, but the comprehension's just not there. And that's been the Achilles heel of them. And that's never been the Achilles heel of reading recovery. So I want you to speak to that. And this is where I was supposed to ask about the role of writing and talking in reading text. So I got a little ahead of you on that one. But let's just talk comprehension for a moment, and why recovery is so successful with that, because it is, okay, and the data is there to show that it is. And if you look at what Works Clearinghouse, the other guys don't have that yet.
Right. Well, and Evidence for ESSA would be the other site that has positively reviewed our comprehension outcomes as we work with students. The point of reading is to figure out the message the author is trying to relay. If you can pull the letters and the sounds off the page out of a sentence, but not understand that sentence, What's the point? Now, Sam, like you, I spend a ton of time on social media, and I spend a lot of time on Facebook groups that are on all sides of this kind of debate, on the science of reading side, on the whole language side, on the balanced literacy side in terms of classroom instruction. And it surprises me. It doesn't surprise me, actually. It concerns me with the number of folks who are now getting to the point and asking questions in those Facebook groups in particular about, wow, he's decoded, this student A is decoding really well, but he doesn't understand a thing he reads. That's not learning how to read. That's learning how to decode. Decode is a part of learning how to read, but it's a small part. It's the first foundational part. I think that as I think about the work that reading recovery teachers do with students, one of the great benefits that we do with comprehension is really connecting reading and writing. And as we help students learn how to write, not only are they figuring out, wow, I'm reading to figure out what this other guy is trying to tell me, I can also send my message out and let other people know what I'm thinking through my own writing. And I really believe that connection and the conversation that happens around book reading and writing, sentence structures, you cut up sentences. My kids loved cut up sentences, loved cut up sentences. I did too, actually, because it was enjoyable to kind of figure out if they could figure it out. Those things really connect together to develop comprehension. I hope that our friends in the science of reading movement, and that's a specific kind of group of them. I hope that at some point they figure out comprehension is still lacking there and figure out instructional practices that will help bridge that gap from what they're doing in the classroom to where those students really need to be when they finish first grade, when they finish second grade, and they finish third grade.
Okay, and one of the things I've pushed back on them a lot is their denial of the fact that there's such a thing as word callers, and yet there's a whole body of research around that. And in part, that's in response to the fact that back in the day when I was doing my work, we had a unnamed basal reader, I don't want to be sued, that had a tendency to produce lots of word callers. They could decode just fine, don't remember a thing. And then those kids get misidentified as learning disabled. When in point of fact, what's happened is they've been taught to read in a manner where they don't get the key thing, that the whole point of it all is to make meaning. And that is just a shame. So, well, thank you for letting me rant.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Finally, on this whole business of when I was trained, and that's been a while, I was taught to, first of all, pick texts that would support my teaching points. Okay. You don't just go in the room and pick out a level, whatever text, and that's what you're going to know. You know what your teaching point is, and then you look for texts that will give you lots of opportunities to handle that teaching point. So that said, I was also taught that at least my person preferred we have a variety of text. Now, in the day, we didn't have anything that was called decodable, but there were texts like that. And predictable, and of course trade books, and we had a good mix, and that's what my supervisor looked for, is having that mix. So is that still the way it is? And what about this whole business of predictable, decodables, and trade? Is there a place for all of them? Because right now it seems that our science of reading friends are saying there's no place for predictables. Yeah. And the only thing, and you have to have years of decodables before you do anything else. I don't think that jives with the way we successfully do things in recovery. So I'll let you bring me up to date on what's going on with decodables and predictables and trade books.
Sure. One of the important and one of the things I haven't said yet today, but is really important, is reading recovery is not necessarily a program like many of those scripted programs that are out there. We're really a professional development model. Our strength is in the amount of training that we give to teachers and the quality of that training, so that they have the instructional dexterity to really make the choices that make sense for the needs of the individual student. Our reading recovery teachers and teacher leaders have have vast, vast libraries of books. And that's because every particular student has a different interest level in books. Some like dogs, some likes insects, some can't stand dogs and they don't want to read a book about a dog. Some of them are more phonics kind of structured, and we'll call them decodable. They are a little more consistent in sounds and words than others. Some have great pictures, some have no pictures. I think that each of our teachers pick, they don't have 10 books that they use. Okay, if you're level 1, you're going to use this book. If you're level 2, you're going to use this book. They have to select books that make sense for what the student needs and what the interest of that student is. There is no evidence to date that shows that decodables are better than other options. It's just not there. There's no evidence, there's no research that shows that decodables are a strong choice, but it hurts my heart to hear people who are throwing away vast amounts of non-decodable books, so predictable pattern, trade books, whatever, and they're pulling them out of their classroom. How's a student going to learn to love to read about topics they enjoy if they only have these stilted, not well crafted? And I'll argue right now, one of the biggest problems in the science of reading movement is there aren't enough high quality decodables. They're really awful books. And students know they're awful books. They don't generate that joy when they're reading some of these really stilted language. They're just awful. And hopefully, as that side of the continuum continues to evolve and change their rhetoric and change their practices, find publishers who will put better decodable books together and authors who will write better decodable books so that students actually enjoy reading them.
Okay, and one of the ironies of just lately is my very good friend Lucy Hawkins did create a large number of really good decodable books, and and Dr. Messmer has done a lot of the same. So that is happening, but sometimes, especially in the case of Hawkins, they're still under fierce attack, even though they're doing decodables better than many of the decodable people have been doing.
Yeah, it's
I think there's an irony to that.
There is. Absolutely. It's amusing if it weren't so frustrating.
Right. Well, we've hit that point now where it's final thoughts and comments time. So anything you really wanted to get out there and say, this will be your chance. I'll just put my 2 cents in first, if I may, that as a centrist, what I have been saying for the longest time is we have to draw from all these things. We have to be willing to use things from all the different aspects. And there shouldn't be the dichotomies and creating dichotomies. All dichotomies create are pendulum swings. Okay, we've got to stop listening to fringe people on either side of the issue and start finding out our common ground in the middle. And I think that when that happens, for instance, when the Reading Research Quarterly people got together for those 2 famous issues and talked to each other about things, it turned out that none of them were as far away from their different points. Many of them came back toward the center. And so listening to folks from all sides and using research from all sides, not using research as a weapon to prove something, but using research as what it's supposed to be. And I think that P. David Pearson said that settled science is an oxymoron.
Yeah.
So, and settled science is an oxymoron. So once again, thanks for letting me rant for a minute, but now it's your turn. Your final thoughts and comments.
Sure. I think that one of the things that I appreciate about the work that you've done is you're really trying to articulate this space that says all sides have valid points and all sides need to talk to each other. And what's unfortunate right now is we've got sides who have move to the extremes, and loyalty to an ideology is more important than what actually impacts students and what actually helps students learn to read and write. And we're never going to produce the outcomes we're looking for in K-12 education if we have loyalty to ideology, particularly when that ideology is not proven. And I'll argue that even within reading recovery, we've got to make sure that we're listening to all sides, that we're integrating in new research and new learning and new practices to make sure that we continue with the time. We continue to make those changes, both incrementally and more dramatically as we need to, so that it benefits the students. The students are getting lost in this conversation. They're used as a caricature, they're used as a story, but we're not actually talking about what's the impact on students. And until we do that, we're not going to get anywhere.
Well, that is so well said. And, you know, now we've reached that point in a Bomarito interview where we have that silly tradition, not so silly tradition, of the Zoom wave goodbye. So if you would, we're just going to give everyone a Zoom wave goodbye. And thank you so much.
Great. Have a great weekend.
You too.